Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan Unshuffled and to a special episode this week. It's Riverside week, and so I'm trying to promote and talk about one of my favorite bands here, Riverside, and this is the episode where I'm going to go through their entire catalog and rank their albums. So I'm going to try to minimize the preamble. I always go off and rattle on too long with it, but this is my personal preferences of the albums. I think they're all fantastic and all worth checking out. So really it's arbitrary how they rank here, but just gives me a fun excuse to talk through the albums. So let me get into it with album number 8. These are their 8 studio albums. So at number 8 is Wasteland from 2018. This is their previous album before the new one that's coming out this week. And it's a really important album in their catalog. You know, to rank this last makes it sound like it's not as good of an album, but it really is a strong album and a great statement from the band under really bad circumstances. They lost their previous guitarist, Peter Grudzinski, and it was quite a traumatic experience for the band, losing a member and under such sudden circumstances. And this album was somewhat of their way to deal with that in a lot of ways, you know, and it's surprising to me. I thought this would be a much more softer, somber album, you know, basically like a funeral type vibe, but there's some heavier tracks on here as well. It's surprisingly heavy, but I guess that's part of it, that they're dealing with a lot of heavy themes and a lot of, you know, they're feeling angry in some ways about what happened at the same time as feeling sad. So it really goes through a lot of different moods throughout its runtime, and it has a lot of cool classic songs on it that I really enjoy. There are some more plaintive, more thoughtful ballads like Guardian Angel and Lament, but they go really all out in the instrumental, The Struggle for Survival, which is a really big, epic progressive metal instrumental where they're able to show their chops a little bit. So it only ranks this low because I feel like with the absence of the guitarist, you know, they really somewhat went forward as a three-piece for this album, and I think the absence of a guitarist is a little bit felt here. Feels like it's missing something a little bit, but maybe that's part of the concept of the album, you know, they're missing someone from their band, and so his absence is felt, which is part of the theme itself of the album. So in some ways that actually helps towards the theme of the album, but I feel like it's a really solid release, but doesn't really have a standout track that I would point to as like, oh, this is a classic Riverside track that I love. But it's really solid, has some great moments on it, has a great balance of these heavier moments and darker moments, but also some more beautiful ballads and really thoughtful lyrics and plaintive feel. So it really strikes a good balance, and I find it to be a really pleasant record and a great way to really deal with the grief of what the band was dealing with at the time, and so really accurately captures that feeling. Album number 7, moving on to Rapid Eye Movement from 2007. This is really the culmination and finale to their first trilogy of albums, which were a continuous conceptual piece called the Reality Dream Trilogy, essentially. And I think this is the weakest of the three, but it's still solid. Once again, has some really incredible tracks, and it really makes for a blend between the first two albums. It has the atmospheric, more Pink Floyd vibey nature of Out of Myself, but adds in a bit of that crunch and heaviness that they introduced with Second Life Syndrome to provide a bit of an amalgamation of those two feels. But I feel like it's done a little bit better perhaps on the previous two albums, where here it doesn't really measure up quite in the same way, but it still is a really strong album with some incredible moments and some great songs. Panic Room is a really cool single from them that sounds really unique and special, and I like how it takes a bit of a more modern take on their sound, because a lot of times they're diving into the past, sounding like Pink Floyd or Rush or previous artists, maybe even a bit of like a Dream Theater vibe in their more progressive metal sections. But it's cool when they're able to incorporate more modern aesthetics and sounds to their soundscape, and I think this album really developed that a little bit by adding a little bit of more of an electronica type nature to it. But it's a really dark album. It has a lot of great moments. Ultimate Trip at the end is a fun extended piece, but probably not quite as good as some of the extended epics on Second Life Syndrome. So it's a good album, but it feels like it doesn't quite measure up to some of the other ones that surround it. And so it just gets a little bit lost in that shuffle. But definitely re-exploring it for this ranking project made me realize how strong it is for being considered perhaps one of their weaker albums. I think there's a lot of great stuff on it, and it just is another showcase that this is a band that doesn't have a weak album, that all of these albums are really strong and really have moments that shine. And to accentuate that point, at number 6 is Out of Myself from 2003, their debut album. Which I think a lot of people would probably rank this higher. I'm probably lower on it than most. But I tend to rank debut albums a little bit lower just because I feel like it's a band still trying to find their footing, that they somewhat develop more into who they really want to be as artists as they continue in their career. So I always look at their debut as more of an interesting, like, okay, this is their statement for who they felt they were right off the bat. A little bit of a raw look at what the band was trying to do when they were starting out, but that they would refine that as they'd continue on through their catalog. But that being said, it's a remarkable debut that really allowed them to hit the gate running and was really something that was really embraced by critics and by people listening. You know, they immediately really had a hit on their hands within the prog community. I remember I actually wasn't really listening much to music at this period of time, you know, listening to prog music because of other stuff that I was doing that was taking focus away from it. But I returned to prog in a big way in about 2006 or 7, and I had heard such buzz about Riverside and about what they were doing that I had to buy their previous albums. Sort of sight unseen. You know, I hadn't heard a note of it, but a lot of people that I trusted were speaking so highly of the band, and Out of Myself was probably the first album I heard from that. I bought this as well as Second Life Syndrome based on the rave reviews they were getting, and was blown away by the sound. And it gets better even with repeated listens. It just starts with a really cool expanded piece called The Same River, which I think really showcases their style. It's this extended, almost Pink Floyd-ish atmospheric build that builds into a more heavy, aggressive type number. And I think that really shows the balance between these two sides of their sound. And there's a lot of cool singles, some like really beautiful acoustic songs like I Believe. And it just really continues. They even have some really cool instrumental moments that spark a bit of that virtuosic playing that Dream Theater or a band like Haken is known to do. And so they really run the gamut in this somewhat short album, and it really works well. And it's dealing with this theme of these stories of love and loss and inner battles and sorrow and mental pain. It's the start of this Reality Dream trilogy that really delves into emotional concepts. And for that, it's a really excellent album right out the gates, and probably a good starting point for people trying to get into Riverside, really. I think it's good to just start at the beginning and just move forward from there. So just a really solid debut that really showcased that the band knew who they were and had a great identity right off the bat in their debut before they even got into their future albums, and that's a really remarkable thing. Speaking of identity, number 5 is their new album, ID Entity, from this year. It's coming out this Friday. I've been really loving this album. I've been listening to it quite a bit over the past few weeks for purposes of reviewing it on this channel, and I just find it to be quite a pleasure. It's a cool blend of some old school vibes of Riverside, but also infusing something new and different with this more 80s style aesthetic to some of the tracks, especially the opener, Friend or Foe, has that it baked into it, which I think is a really fascinating sound for them. I could tell that they're trying to have a bit more fun and excitement on this album to really offset the somber and darker tones of the prior album, Wasteland. And so that's really felt here. And they're trying to give this more live feel to bring more excitement into their sound, because they know their fans really like this live atmosphere and their live sound. And so it really is showcased on this album and gives it a bit of that fun vibe that I think they needed into their sound. And it has an incredible epic length song, The Place Where I Belong, and it's just a really solid release. I was really battling between this and the next album for which should go 5 and 4. They really are interchangeable to me. Very similar albums, but this one is just a really cool new album that I probably need more time with to really dial in where it should fit in this list. But I like the theme of the album, dealing with somewhat of our modern society and how people try to identify us and try to box you into a category when you need to find out for yourself who you really are and find your true identity. I think it's a great theme and very, very rich in this modern era that we live in. I think it's very relevant for what we deal with in our lives. So for that reason, I think it deserves to place highly on this list. So I put it there at number 5. At number 4, we have Shrine of New Generation Slaves from 2013. And I will admittedly say I was a little bit disappointed when this album first came out. I thought it was a little bit too much of a deviation from the sound that I had liked from them, because they had this Reality Dream trilogy that I thought was a really cool set of concept albums that were interlocking and had a good blend between the progressive metal style I liked and a bit of that atmospheric Pink Floyd layer on top of it. And it just created a cool blend and a cool storyline. And then they did ADHD, which was a cool, heavy burst of energy that just really got me going. And I was really impressed with it. I thought that was an incredible record at the time. So this came out, and it's a little bit more song-based. You know, it's a little bit more about having these individualistic songs that aren't really super connected. Maybe there's a thematic link between all of the songs, obviously, but it didn't feel as conceptual as some of their previous albums were, so thus it didn't feel as connected as I wanted it to, and it felt like they were going for this different approach that really was going away from the progressive metal side of their sound and more into this song-based approach of just having these solid rock songs that touched on some modern issues. But listening to it more and more has made me realize how brilliant the album really is. It just goes through so many different great types of stuff, really touches on modern consumerism and all the things, all the trappings of our modern society that tells us what we should do. Once again, maybe similar themes to what I was saying with Identity, but I think it's done really well here, especially on something like Escalator Shrine, which is one of their classic epic songs that really talks about, you know, this consumerism idea and how we're just somewhat slaves to what people want us to think and what people want us to buy, and how it sort of washes out who we even are as people. It makes us slaves to society and to this big business that's trying to tell us who we should be. And I think that's a great thematically rich concept, once again, and something they deal with very well. And so it's a great exploration of that with some really great songs, some that hit very hard, some heavier songs here, but also some lighter acoustic songs like We Got Used to Us. Deprived was one that surprised me, a really cool song, an 8-minute track that even features some saxophone at the end. So they're going for something a little bit different. They're being a little bit experimental, but not playing too far away from the soundscape that they're known for, and I think it creates a really great compact list of songs that really work well. And so I think this really was a successful album that only gets better upon repeated listens. So that's what I have at number 4. Now at number 3, I have the aforementioned Anno Domini High Definition from 2009. And like I said, I was really impressed when this first came out because it's a very short album comparatively. What I like about Riverside is they utilize their time on their albums really well, if that makes sense. All their albums are fairly short-ish. You know, they're never usually over an hour long. And I think the length really helps it to be a very compact, cool piece of music. And that is really accentuated on this album, where it's under 45 minutes long. It's only 5 tracks, but each track is really strong. Hits you hard. I think while the Reality Dream trilogy was a bit more of a blend of different things, was had this atmospheric feel, a classic rock feel, maybe a little bit of a proggy feel, but then some metal also baked in. This is where they really embrace their prog metal side, and it's really heavily proggy. Every track has its really heavy moments, and it just is an unrelenting masterpiece. It just really continues onward, where every track is just a really strong statement by the band. And once again, it's dealing with very personal issues. It's full of depression and introspection concerning the new modern world we live in. Once again, how we're developing apathy and pretty much living robotic lives within our consumer society. That's basically the themes that we're looking at here, which is similar to the other albums that I've just been talking about. And that's obviously something that Mari's Duda really thinks about a lot, is how our modern society is really almost killing us and killing our individuality and turning us into something that maybe isn't so great. And I think this album especially deals a lot with mental illness and things of that nature. The ADHD acronym for the title really brings that to mind, how the society that we live in probably leads people to these types of conditions in a lot of ways, or at least exacerbates or makes them worse. And like on Left Out, how a lot of those types of people are left out of society because they don't fit in to the mold. And in some ways, it's sort of a reaction to the society that we live in, and how it makes you, when you're someone who deals with a lot of these mental issues, tends to make you shrink inside and to not become a part of everything, which in turn makes you left out of society in general. So it plays on those types of themes, and I think it really does it expertly well, while crafting some really cool progressive metal tracks with some great instrumental moments and some fun moments. Really, even though it's a dark subject matter, they really are able to have fun with their instruments here and craft something that's really great to listen to, and just a compact, fun listen. And it's always been a favorite of mine. Number 2 has been one that slowly crept up on my list. Once again, when I first heard it, I liked it, but it didn't quite strike me as hard as it does now. And that's Love, Fear, and the Time Machine from 2015. I adore this album. I think it's a really great statement by the band. And I always mistakenly think about this album like, oh, this is their acoustic album. This is their light album where they decided to put aside all of the progressive metal leanings and just do a very light acoustic rock album. But really, if you explore it and re-listen to it, it really runs the gamut to a lot of different feels and flavors. There are some slightly heavier moments. There are some more proggy moments baked into some of these pieces. But overall, it does give a bit of a lighter feel, a more warm, lush sound than we're used to from the band, where their previous albums were very dark and very moody and focused on these very dark themes. And once again, we get a bit of that dark thematic elements to this also. We get a lot of stuff about feeling lost and being addicted to things, and having moments where you're feeling unsure and having fear. All of that stuff is baked in, but it really is a message of hope. Especially the second half of the album, we're looking at more hopeful scenarios of discarding that fear, of trying to find the light at the end of the tunnel and trying to get through some of these darker times. And I think it's a great statement by the band that there is hope by looking backwards and finding comfort in the past and learning lessons from what we've had to deal with before. It can lead us to a brighter future, and I think that has thematic relevance to me in my life. And so it's just an album that's had deep meaning to me and has given me a bit of hope in darker times that I think is well needed. And if you know me and my channel, I tend to gravitate towards things that have a bit more of a positive message, so I think that's why this resonates with me so well. And it brings back memories of taking my dad to go see Riverside when they came around the LA area. I believe this was their most recent album. My dad hadn't heard Riverside before, and so this was the latest album, so I played it for him, figuring they'd play a lot of tracks from it. And he really enjoyed it. I think it was the perfect introduction for him, because he's not really into the heavier side of prog. He's not really a prog metal guy, so to speak. And I think this was a good gateway and really brings back fond memories of my time listening to this with my dad. So that's baked into my thoughts and feelings about this. But I just think it's a really solid album. Beautiful melodies, some of their best songcraft, and it really just hits me in a great way. and really is a stellar piece of work that I think they should be proud of. But there can only be number one. There can only be one number one album, right? There can only be one at the top of the heap here, and for me that is Second Life Syndrome from 2005. And mostly just because this is the gateway album. This is the one that really stuck for me, where I was like, this is a band that's doing something special, and this is where they catapulted into becoming one of my favorite bands. And I think it's because they took a bit of that sound from their first album, the atmospheric Pink Floyd-y type stuff with a bit of heavy aggression, and they accentuated a lot of the heaviness. They really dialed into these darker feels, but really did so in an expert way with a lot of great storytelling to craft an album that was like Out of Myself, but on steroids in a lot of ways, you know. Had a lot of those touchstones and elements, but did something singular and interesting also. And it features two really great extended pieces, the title track, Second Life Syndrome, as well as Dance with the Shadow, which comes later in the album. There's some great shorter tracks that are really beautiful as well. A great instrumental in Reality Dream 3, which is probably my favorite of the Reality Dream series. I love Conceiving You. I think it's a beautiful ballad. Really starts off with energy with Voltface. It's a really energetic, fun album. And I keep saying fun, like, you know, even though these are darker themes, you know, a lot of this album is dealing with, like I said, loss and troubling situations with your own mental health, and trying to escape a bad relationship, perhaps, is baked into the theme here. But I think it's really done in a way where they pay respect to the theme and it all makes sense, but it also is able to play with the musicianship and give you something satisfying in the musician aspect, with some really cool playouts and some really cool instrumental sections. So it just runs the gamut between all the things you want to hear from Riverside, and it just will always remain as one of my favorite albums of all time, because I think it really blends what they're all about in such a fantastic way. And listening through, it's like each track is a hit for me. You know, each track is like, oh yeah, I love this track. Oh, and I love this track. You know, to me, that's the sign of an expertly crafted album, of a great album, is that every single track is special in its own way. It's singular and has its own identity, but as a track list all combined, it also holds together as a conceptual piece. And so I think it's just a really strong album, and probably the best statement of what the band's all about. For that reason, I'll probably always keep it at the top of the pile here. But all of these albums are incredible. I think Riverside is one of the most consistent bands. Every album they've done has been strong, and I just am in awe of their talent and their ability to bring these thematic stuff to bear. They really focus on modern issues, but do so in a tactful way, and it's really relevant to me and in my life. So I'm grateful for them as a band, and really happy to have been able to discuss them at length at this episode. So thank you guys for joining me. I hope you liked the list that I presented today, and please present your list in the comments. I know a lot of you will have different lists and probably disagree with my placements and such, but as I like to remind everyone, this is just my personal preferences, and when it comes down to just my personal taste, I really can't be wrong about it, because it's a reflection of who I am and how I hear the music, which is singular and different than how everyone else does. So just celebrate the fact that you have your own list, your own tastes, and that you can feel special about what you've crafted as your favorites. So, but thank you guys once again for joining me, and keep enjoying the music out there. I'm really appreciative of all the support, and I hope you guys have been enjoying these shows lately, and that you've been finding some value in hearing about this band. Maybe it'll inspire you to check them out, or inspire you to revisit their catalog and be reminded of how brilliant they are. So thank you guys so much, and I'll catch you guys in a future episode. Bye everybody. Enjoy the music.